Welcome to Echoes of Africa, where Africa's story is not told for us, it's told by us. Today, we're examining a fight over African sovereignty that goes beyond borders. In Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré has broken from France, nationalized gold mines, denounced neo-colonial influence, and forged alliances with Russia. In response, President Macron and his former prime minister have implied that Africans aren't yet ready to govern themselves, warning that coups like this could backfire, causing chaos in Africa and the West. Who gets to decide what sovereignty looks like? Is Traoré a symbol of African liberation or a risky gamble? And what does Macron really mean by not ready? Today, Echoes of Africa dives deeper. To my left, Kwame, our wise Pan-African thinker. And to my right, Jerry, our contrarian seeking the hard truth. Let's begin.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to cut through the noise, really get to the heart of complex topics, and bring you the key insights. Today, we're plunging into something incredibly powerful, often really contentious: African sovereignty, and the shifting dynamics of power across the continent. We're going to unpack critical insights from a, fascinating range of sources, using a real-world case study that brings these huge ideas into sharp, undeniable focus. Our deep dive today centers on Burkina Faso, right there in the heart of the Sahel, and the audacious, you could even say revolutionary actions of Captain Ibrahim Traoré. I mean, he's made some incredibly bold moves, a dramatic break from France, nationalizing gold mines, very vocally denouncing what he calls neocolonial influence, and then forging new alliances with countries like Russia, Turkey. This isn't just some local story, It's a living, breathing case study. Raises fundamental questions for all of us. Questions like, who really gets to decide what sovereignty looks like for African nations? Is Traoré a symbol of maybe a new era of African liberation, a response to centuries of external control? Or is he, as some people, including President Macron, have kind of implied, taking a really risky gamble, one that could just spiral into chaos? And when we hear world leaders suggesting Africans aren't ready to govern themselves, what does not ready actually mean in that context? So, to help us navigate all this intricate material, unpack the historical threads, and really connect the dots to today's realities, we have our brilliant expert speaker with us, ready to shed some light.
It's great to be here. This is such a critical topic, really, for understanding not just Africa, but global power dynamics, the future of the continent in many ways. And you're right, it's not just about one country or one leader. It's about these persistent historical forces bumping up against powerful, very contemporary aspirations for self-determination. It's a fascinating and honestly sometimes a very painful intersection to look at.
Okay, let's start unpacking this then. Our sources really hammer this point home. To get what's happening now in Burkina Faso, you absolutely have to look at the colonial legacy. It's not just history class stuff. It's like an active blueprint, right, shaping today. And when we talk about neocolonialism, what the sources are describing is, it's where a former colonial power still holds significant sway, but not through direct rule. It's more subtle, economic, military, cultural levers.
Absolutely. That's precisely it. And what's truly striking is how that colonial blueprint, that dependency model laid down, decades or even centuries ago, still shapes things with remarkable precision. Take France in West Africa. They didn't just govern. They structured the entire economy. And not for the benefit of Africans, let's be clear. It was explicitly for France's gain. We're talking forced taxes, draining local wealth, forced labor building infrastructure, but infrastructure for extraction, even telling people what crops to grow, not for food, not for local markets, but to feed French industries. It was pure wealth extraction by design, never about fostering local, sustainable economies.
So even after independence, when the flags changed in the 60s, the actual systems of control, they just kind of stayed. Our sources are saying this isn't a footnote, it's an active lever.
Precisely. The sources are incredibly clear on this. Formal independence happened, yes, but what followed was this powerful, almost insidious grip of neocolonialism. The CFA franc is a prime example, a currency system inherited straight from colonial times. Our sources detail how nations using it, like Burkina Faso, have to deposit a huge chunk of their foreign reserves, often 50% or more, into an account controlled by the French Treasury.
50%, wow.
Yes, and that effectively gives France a significant, maybe indirect, but very real say in their monetary policy. It limits their ability to manage their own currency, devalue to boost exports, control inflation for their own needs. It's a subtle but incredibly powerful economic lever. decades after independence. Then you've got the French military bases, still there on African soil, often without clear exit strategies, and corporate agreements, mining deals, resource contracts, heavily skewed towards foreign firms, often at the expense of local business, national revenue. These aren't just historical leftovers. They're active, pervasive systems. They shape economic stability, who controls resources, international relations right now.
Yep.
They dictate who profits, who builds, and frankly, who often stays indebted.
And Burkina Faso specifically.
Yeah. But there's a strong echo of this past, isn't there? Particularly with Thomas Sankara.
Yeah.
Our sources point out he fought this exact fight, nationalizing land, pushing self-sufficiency.
Only for those systems to creep back after his death. So Traoré's actions now nationalizing gold, kicking out the French military, it's seen as directly echoing Sankara. Is it just history repeating, or is something different this time?
That's a crucial connection. And yes, the sources absolutely frame Traoré's actions in that lineage, the lineage of Sankara. Sankara's vision in the 80s was radical self-reliance. His bold moves against foreign control, nationalizing land for farmers, ending reliance on imported food that was a direct challenge to these neocolonial systems. His assassination in 87, well, many link it to his anti-imperialist stance, and it led to a swift rollback of many reforms. The old economic blueprints returned. The fact that those systems could just be reestablished so quickly after he was gone, it really reinforces the argument that those colonial chains continue to bind, often through compliant local elites. So Traoré's moves today, especially the gold nationalization, the French expulsion, they're definitely positioned in the sources as a direct modern version of Sankara's fight. It's not just an echo. It feels almost like a deliberate historical reenactment, driven by the same deep frustration, but maybe, just maybe, with a new urgency, and perhaps different global partners available now.
Okay, so let's bring this home for the listener. Why should you care about all this colonial history when we're talking about today's headlines? What's the relevance?
That's a fair question. It's not just about, historical curiosity. It's about understanding that these historical blueprints directly impact today's challenges. They fundamentally shape the playing field for African nations. Those structures from decades ago, they still dictate why some nations struggle with development despite having immense resources. They dictate who controls Africa's vast wealth, minerals, agriculture, and they dictate how African nations interact on the global stage. If you want to understand why a country rich in gold, say, still struggles with poverty, or why certain tensions persist between African states and former colonial powers, you have to look at this continuum. It helps you see that current problems aren't always just internally generated. They often have deep roots in systems imposed from outside, systems never designed for African prosperity in the first place. It's like trying to understand why a building is shaky without looking at its foundations. You just miss the full picture.
Right. Which brings us right to Captain Ibrahim Traoré and his, audacious moves. Our sources paint him as this remarkably young revolutionary, only 35 when he took power in October 2022, and he came in immediately with these really strong vows. Fighting corruption, empowering the youth, absolute self-reliance. It sounds like more than just another coup, doesn't it? It feels almost generational.
It's absolutely presented that way. A significant break from the norm, a stark contrast to many older, often Western-aligned leaders in the region. And what's fascinating is how fast he moved to turn those vows into concrete, pretty drastic policies. Like he had this urgent checklist. He didn't just talk self-reliance. He moved immediately to nationalize gold mines. Not a slow negotiation, a swift, decisive move. And crucially, he also started creating a local refinery to process the gold inside Burkina Faso, aiming to capture the whole value chain, keep the profits, the processing jobs in the country, instead of just shipping raw ore out.
Yeah, that's a direct challenge to that resource trap you mentioned.
Exactly, where the wealth just flows out.
And then the really seismic move, kicking out the French army. February 2023, our sources really stress that this was seen as impossible before. A red line nobody dared cross. That's a massive statement. Militarily, symbolically, politically.
Huge. A direct, unambiguous challenge to that whole idea of persistent foreign military presence, which for many Africans is the ultimate symbol of neocolonial influence, isn't it? For decades, French forces were there in the Sahel, ostensibly fighting terrorism, sure. But many saw their presence as perpetuating dependency, limiting sovereignty. Traoré's move was a powerful assertion of national dignity. And alongside that, he started this strategic pivot, actively forging new ties with Russia, with Turkey. That move is about expanding options, isn't it? Getting beyond just the traditional Western partners, diversifying reliance, seeking partnerships on, what they hope are more equal terms, not just accepting the old conditions.
Sure, it brings new complexities, maybe new dependencies down the line, but...
But for many, it's seen as a necessary step to escape the old ones, a calculated risk perhaps.
And it wasn't just these big geopolitical shifts, right? The sources mention very practical ground level changes too, affecting ordinary people. Things like ambitious agro-industrial projects, even talk of a steel plant for local produce like tomatoes, and direct measures for food security, suspending certain permits, plus creating a postal bank to move away from the CFA franc. These are bold, hands-on policies impacting daily life.
They are. And what's striking is the sheer breadth of it. From national resource control right down to food security and financial autonomy. The idea of a steel plant for tomatoes, it sounds specific, but it's about vertical integration. You grow the tomatoes, you process them, you package them, you market them, capturing more value domestically instead of just exporting raw produce. That directly boosts the local economy, creates jobs all along that chain, reduces reliance on imports, key parts of economic self-reliance. And the postal bank, that's a direct shot at the CFA franc's external control. It signals a clear intent to move towards real monetary sovereignty, managing their own currency, their own financial policy without Paris looking over their shoulder. Taken together, these actions are a comprehensive top-to-bottom push for genuine self-determination. Driven by a clear vision, national wealth should benefit the nation's citizens.
Okay, but here's where it gets really complex, where the rubber meets the road, maybe in a painful way. Our sources don't sugarcoat the cost of this boldness. They explicitly note a stark, truly tragic consequence. Violence in Burkina Faso doubled after Traoré took over. Thousands killed. Over 7,200 people just in 2024 alone, making it one of the most violent places on earth right now. That immediately raises painful questions. Are these drastic moves, however well-intentioned ideologically, worth the immense human cost? The increased instability? It sounds a lot like that risky gamble Macron mentioned.
It does. And this is perhaps the most difficult trade-off any nation pursuing sovereignty so aggressively has to face, especially in a region already plagued by instability. That surge in violence, those horrific casualty numbers, it's a real tragic consequence. It highlights the huge security challenges already there in the Sahel, challenges that were definitely exacerbated by the French withdrawal, no question. Our sources frame Traoré's leadership as this youth revolution, built on nationalistic promise, a deep desire for self-determination. That gives him popular legitimacy, especially with young people. But they also candidly note its lack of political inclusivity. I mean, it was a military coup, not an election. Critics point to limits on political freedoms. It's not a democratic transition in the classic sense. That adds layers of complexity, layers of risk. The chaos, devastating as it is seen by some, particularly those who support Traoré's vision as the violent birth pangs of a nation trying to reclaim its destiny. It's a brutal framing, but it reflects the high-stakes gamble, where thousands of lives are tragically caught in the balance.
So you have this leader taking aggressive steps for national destiny, for sovereignty, and on the other hand, this terrible human cost, instability, violence, staggering loss of life. For you, the listener, trying to grasp this, what are those immediate trade-offs when a nation pushes this hard for sovereignty? How do leaders possibly balance those nationalistic dreams with the urgent, desperate need for basic safety for their people?
That's the absolute core dilemma, isn't it? Especially in volatile regions. The trade-off is often between immediate, short-term stability, which might, be propped up by external help, often with strings attached, and that long-term fundamental goal of true self-determination. When you make deep structural changes, nationalizing resources, kicking out foreign militaries, you inherently disrupt existing power structures. That disruption creates vacuums. It disorients people. And it can provoke violent reactions from those who benefited from the old system. Foreign interests, maybe, or internal actors aligned with them. So increased insecurity, at least in the short term, is often a consequence. As the old order falls apart and a new one struggles to emerge, the immense challenge for leaders like Traoré is managing that incredibly volatile transition, building effective new security structures, while also somehow ensuring basic safety for citizens right now. It's an incredibly difficult tightrope walk. The stakes are existential. The path forward, anything but clear.
And this leads us right into the international reactions, particularly those comments from President Macron. The sources say he implied Africans hadn't taken full responsibility for their sovereignty, and even urged gratitude for France's help fighting jihadists.
Yes, those statements landed heavily, deeply controversial, as you said. The implication that African nations weren't ready or hadn't taken full responsibility, it carries this profoundly paternalistic tone. It suggests a fundamental lack of agency, which feeds right back into that historical narrative of external oversight, external control, the narrative that justified colonial rule for centuries. And the call for gratitude for France's counterterrorism work, well, from one perspective, may be understandable. But it completely ignores the historical complexities, doesn't it? The perceived costs of that French presence for many Africans, The long-standing critique that foreign military intervention, while maybe offering temporary relief sometimes, often fails to address the root causes of instability. Can even make things worse in the long run.
It sounds like our sources connect this sentiment to a broader pattern, what they call French arrogance. They even bring up Sarkozy's infamous Dakar speech back in 2007, claiming Africa hadn't fully entered into history. Shocking stuff. This narrative seems designed, maybe intentionally, maybe not, but designed to diminish African agency, imply perpetual dependence.
That's precisely the argument the sources make. And it's a powerful one. When a leader of a former colonial power says things like that, it's not heard in a vacuum in Africa. It resonates with this long, painful history of patronizing remarks, policies, actions, all consistently undermining African self-determination, African dignity. Sarkozy's speech, deeply offensive to so many, suggesting Africa lacked its own history, its own identity, its own contributions. Macron's remarks, even if maybe less overtly inflammatory in some ways, they fit into that perceived pattern for many listeners. They imply African nations are somehow eternally immature, incapable of managing their own affairs, which then implicitly justifies continued external influence or intervention. It raises that crucial question: how do these narratives projected by powerful nations impact the self-perception, the political will of developing countries, especially those actively trying to assert their independence right now?
That's a key point. But I can hear some listeners, maybe skeptics or people in Western governments thinking, hang on, were Macron's harshest quotes even accurate? Wasn't some of that misreported? Our sources do acknowledge that. While some extreme quotes might have been fact-checked as inaccurate, his public statement calling Africans ungrateful was dismissive enough on its own to fuel widespread rage, especially among younger African leaders who feel constantly undermined.
Right. And it's important to distinguish between specific misquotes and the broader sentiment conveyed, which, as the sources highlight, was widely perceived as dismissive and arrogant. Even as some extreme statements were distortions, the core message that African nations were ungrateful for French help that was publicly stated, and widely interpreted as dismissive. For younger African leaders trying to assert a new vision of independence, agency. Comments like that aren't just insensitive. They feel like a continuation of being perpetually undermined, infantilized. It almost doesn't matter if every single word was precisely reported. The overall tone, the implication was enough. Enough to cause deep resentment. Enough to fuel the very anti-French sentiment that Traoré's actions and the broader public mood in Burkina Faso really embody. Perception often matters more than precise fact when you're dealing with historical grievances and national pride.
And it's not just words, is it? Our sources make it clear. France's corporate actions speak louder than any carefully worded denial. They point to how gold profits flow out of our continent while our infrastructure crumbles. It's about what's done, not just what's said.
This is where it gets really tangible. As the sources argue powerfully, you see a country like Burkina Faso, 80% of its exports are gold, yet average income is pennies a day for most. You have to ask, where's that immense wealth going? The sources give concrete evidence. They reference specific details from Reuters, Financial Times reports, mining data, instances of seizures, nationalizations. This data isn't abstract. It reveals the tangible depth of foreign control over vital resources, the huge stakes involved. When a nation's main export generates vast wealth, but it primarily benefits foreign corporations, foreign shareholders, through opaque deals, minimal local ownership, while the local population sees hardly any improvement. No new schools, unreliable hospitals, crumbling roads. It creates this powerful, undeniable narrative of exploitation, that profound imbalance. That's what fuels the push for economic sovereignty. Leaders and citizens alike asking, why aren't our resources developing our country?
So, for you listening, what does this all mean? How do these narratives from powerful nations impact the self-perception, the political will in developing countries? And maybe more critically, how can a nation like Burkina Faso actually assert its sovereignty when external powers have such significant economic and military clout?
It really pushes you to think critically about global power dynamics, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
When powerful nations constantly push a narrative of not ready or ungrateful, it can subtly but effectively erode internal confidence.
Yeah.
It can legitimize external interference. It can almost create a self-fulfilling prophecy of dependence. It undermines local leadership, can discourage African agency. So asserting sovereignty in that environment, it takes immense political will, popular support from citizens, and a courageous willingness to accept potential short-term instability for those long-term gains. It also means seeking out alternative partners like Traoré did to reduce reliance on traditional powers, create a more diversified, less beholden international standing. It's a complex, high-stakes geopolitical chess game, really.
Which brings us right to economic sovereignty. This seems to be absolutely central to Captain Traoré's strategy, his audacious moves. Our sources highlight that stark paradox in Burkina Faso again. 80% of exports are gold, one of Africa's top producers. Yet GDP is stubbornly low, under $20 billion. Average income, shockingly low, among the world's lowest. The critical question, as you said, is where does all that wealth actually go?
It's a classic, tragic example of the resource curse, or maybe more accurately, a resource trap. The gold wealth flows out through foreign-owned mines, opaque financial deals, minimal local ownership, and, the sources explicitly mention, rampant smuggling. So you have this paradox, a nation sitting on literal gold, immense wealth, but its citizens remain impoverished. Basic infrastructure, roads, hospitals, schools crumbles. It's a direct result of systems that prioritize foreign profit over local development, and the mention of child labor in those mines. That underscores the profound ethical, human cost of such an exploitative system. It's not a curse of the gold itself, it's a curse of how it's controlled and extracted.
So the promise of local control is if that wealth actually stayed in Burkina Faso, if those millions from gold staying local could genuinely reinforce hospitals and schools, that would be real sovereignty. That's where it hits home.
Precisely. Real sovereignty isn't just about flags or symbols. It's fundamentally about economic independence, controlling your own resources, ensuring the benefits, the profits, the value add from those resources directly help your own people, your own sustainable development. By nationalizing the mines, and crucially, by investing in that local refinery to process the gold in Burkina Faso, Traoré's government aims to capture more of that value chain. Keep the processing jobs, the tax revenues, the environmental management under national control. Now, new investments, say from Russia or Turkey, they might bring new complexities, new allegiances. But the crucial point the sources stress is that Burkina Faso is now negotiating the terms, not just accepting them. That fundamental shift in power dynamics, from passive recipient to active, assertive negotiator, that's fundamental to real economic self-determination. They're trying to leverage their wealth for their nation, not just for foreign profit.
But I can hear the counter-argument. Hold on, don't these foreign firms build roads, create jobs? Isn't that enough benefit? We hear that a lot, don't we? What's the complex argument our sources make about that jobs versus control dilemma?
It's a valid point, and it's used frequently to justify foreign corporate presence. Foreign firms do bring capital, technology, jobs, sometimes. However, our sources highlight that these benefits often come at a huge long-term cost. We're talking about massive ecological destruction, often without proper safeguards. They detail revenue-sharing deals that are frequently opaque, heavily favoring the foreign company, leaving minimal returns for the host nation. And the jobs created, often low-paying, often lacking significant local skill development or technology transfer, not designed to build sustainable domestic industries. So the argument is, yes, some immediate jobs might appear, but the long-term cost to the environment, the huge loss of national revenue, the perpetuation of a dependent economic model, that far outweighs those often superficial benefits. It's about asking, are those jobs truly building the nation? Or just facilitating wealth extraction for foreign shareholders, leaving the country a little better off in the long run?
Which raises a critical question for you, the listener. How does a nation balance that immediate, pressing need for jobs and infrastructure which foreign firms might offer with the long-term strategic goal of controlling its own resources, its own wealth, its own destiny? What does true economic independence even look like for a developing nation rich in resources, especially one with a history of exploitation?
It's an incredibly tough balance, really nuanced. True economic independence isn't about isolationism, shutting off all foreign investment. It's about self-direction, leverage. It means developing strong local capacity to manage resources, building domestic industries that add value to raw materials instead of just exporting them raw, diversifying the economy beyond just one or two commodities. And it means negotiating international trade and investment deals that genuinely benefit the national interest, not just foreign shareholders. It requires strategic long-term planning, massive investment in education, infrastructure, local expertise, and often really difficult decisions about what kind of foreign investment is truly beneficial. And crucially, on what terms it's allowed. It's a marathon, definitely not a sprint, fraught with challenges, political and economic.
And moving from economic sovereignty, we absolutely have to talk security because that's the most immediate, brutal fallout from instability. Our sources paint a very stark, challenging picture. After the French left, jihadist killings in Burkina Faso soared dramatically. Over 7,200 people killed in 2024 alone. It tragically highlights the region's extreme vulnerability, the instability.
The security vacuum is a grave, immediate concern. That data on fatalities is truly stark. And this isn't just Burkina Faso. The whole Sahel region faces these immense complex security threats from various armed groups, ISIS affiliates, al-Qaeda affiliates. The argument that foreign support can buy time in such a dire situation, it's definitely present in the sources. Acknowledging the immediate, painful human cost of the French withdrawal, it forces this direct, agonizing question. Can immediate security be sacrificed for long-term sovereignty? Should it be? Especially when lives are being lost on such a devastating scale. There's no easy answer. The human tragedy is immense.
But the sources also highlight Traoré's proactive responses. It's not just about expelling the French. He's actively building national volunteer forces, proposing regional armies like the Sahel alliance with Mali and Niger. The vision seems clear. Africa needs to take charge of its own security.
Exactly. This is where the narrative shifts. From just reacting to threats to proactively trying to build solutions from within. Traoré's initiative setting up and training national volunteer forces that reflects a clear commitment to internal capacity building, mobilizing citizens for their own security. And the idea of regional armies like the Sahel alliance with Mali and Niger, that's even more significant. It moves beyond just individual national security to a collective regional approach, recognizing that this threat crosses borders. It requires coordinated African responses. The sources explore the concept of ECOWAS, the African Union, coordinating genuinely unified armies. That's presented as a powerful path to sovereignty without external dependency. This approach understands that true national security ultimately can't be outsourced forever. It has to be built, controlled domestically and regionally. It's a vision of collective self-defense.
That makes so much sense. It's like, yeah, you can hire a guard for your house, but real, lasting security comes when you've secured your own doors, put in your own alarm, maybe even trained your own family to defend yourselves. But you emphasized a critical distinction. Africa learning to negotiate terms with external powers like allies, not masters, that's presented as the real pivot point in power dynamics.
This is arguably the most critical shift, and it's profound. It's not about total isolation. Not rejecting all external partnerships. That's unrealistic, probably detrimental. Instead, it's about fundamentally changing the nature of those relationships, moving away from a donor-recipient dynamic or a patron-client relationship where one side calls all the shots. The goal is to engage with external powers on terms of genuine mutual respect, mutual benefit, where Africa sets its own agenda, clearly defines its own interests, and crucially, refuses to accept conditions that undermine its sovereignty or dictate its internal policies. It's an incredibly challenging path. Sure, external powers are used to having significant influence, but it's absolutely essential for true self-determination, for ensuring partnerships serve Africa's interests first. It's about being an equal player on the global stage, not just a pawn.
So this leads to the big picture question for you, the listener. Can true national security for countries like Burkina Faso really be achieved without complete internal control over defense? And what are the practical challenges, but also the compelling opportunities for regional cooperation in a place as unstable as the Sahel?
The sources strongly suggest that enduring national security absolutely requires internal control, or at least a decisive shift towards African-led regional security. External forces, even if well-intentioned, they often have their own strategic interests. Those might not align perfectly with the host nation's long-term needs, or they might just pull out when their priorities change, leaving a vacuum. We've seen that happen. The practical challenges for regional cooperation, immense. Varying national interests, limited financial and military resources often, political instability within member states, and just the sheer scale and mobility of the security threat itself. Building trust, coordination between different national armies, huge undertaking, but the opportunity is equally compelling. Pooling resources, sharing vital intelligence. A regionally unified force, funded and commanded by Africans. That wouldn't just be more effective against shared threats. It would be a powerful, undeniable symbol of true continental sovereignty, solidarity. It could genuinely transform the security landscape.
Okay, as we pull these threads together, our sources seem to point towards a crucial aha moment, a real shift in perspective that emerges from all this complexity. It's this realization that sovereignty isn't some unrealistic pipe dream that leads to collapse, like some feared or maybe even claimed, but actually it's an absolute necessity for any genuine transformation. That's a massive mental shift, right?
It is a profound shift. Moving beyond that colonial era mindset, for too long the narrative often pushed by external powers, even some internal actors, was that full African sovereignty would inevitably mean instability, economic ruin, inability to cope. Essentially that not ready narrative we talked about. But our sources highlight this growing, powerful counter-understanding. especially among younger African leaders, thinkers, that true transformation, sustainable development, strong governance, resilient economies, real prosperity is simply impossible without local internal control, without Africans holding the reins of their own destiny.
So the core insight, the bottom line, is that transformation needs local control. Control of resources, control of security, control of governance. It's like trying to build a strong, self-sufficient house, but you don't own the land, or you don't control the materials going into it. It just won't stand. Or it won't truly be yours.
Exactly. Without controlling your resources, your wealth gets extracted, enriching others while your people stay poor. Without controlling your security, you're always vulnerable to external influence, internal destabilization that others might exploit, the whims of foreign powers. And without controlling your own governance, making your own laws, shaping your own institutions, decisions get made elsewhere, often without your people's best interests at heart. These are the fundamental pillars the sources identify, interconnected, absolutely essential for any meaningful, sustainable transformation. You just can't build a truly prosperous future on borrowed foundations.
And the material advocates for a comprehensive approach, not just throwing out the old, but building something new, robust, a mix of regional unity, carefully renegotiated treaties, not just tearing everything up, and strong national will. This is presented as the pragmatic path, the way it can actually make it work, turning ambition into reality.
It's a pragmatic and, frankly, deeply intelligent vision. That idea of renegotiated treaties is key. It implies strategic engagement, not isolation, building new relationships on new, equitable terms, terms that genuinely benefit both sides, not just severing all ties. Regional unity leverages collective strength, allows African nations to present a more formidable, cohesive front globally, share resources, intelligence, and strong national will. That's the internal engine, the unshakable determination to pursue self-determination despite the challenges. This multi-pronged approach. It acknowledges the huge complexities of the global landscape, but asserts a clear, achievable path to self-determination. It suggests sovereignty isn't rigid, not all or nothing, it's dynamic, an ongoing process, continuous negotiation, strengthening, evolution.
So the key takeaway from our deep dive today, for you listening, is maybe this. Sovereignty isn't rejection, it's evolution. It's about growth. Self-determination, fundamentally building from within. It's about Africa owning its narrative, its resources, its defense. How does this deeper understanding of sovereignty shift your perspective on global power dynamics, on the agency of nations, especially those often labeled developing?
If you connect this to the bigger picture, it really changes how you view global development, doesn't it? International aid, even geopolitical conflicts, it moves away from a simple binary view, developed versus developing, and instead focuses on agency, self-determination, the historical forces that shape today's reality. It suggests that true sustainable progress for African nations, really, for any nation, comes from their ability to define their own destiny, control their own assets, build their own institutions. Rather than being dictated by outside forces or perpetually relying on external support, it highlights that the struggle for sovereignty is ongoing. It's multifaceted. It covers not just politics and military, but crucial economic and cultural dimensions too. It really is a journey, not a destination.
So today, we've really navigated that intricate tension, haven't we? Between those age-old colonial chains and the new paths African nations are, well, courageously forging. We used Captain Traoré's audacious actions in Burkina Faso as this powerful, living symbol. A symbol of the struggle between self-rule and the potential for chaos that often comes with such deep shifts. We've seen how different perspectives weigh those immediate, often painful challenges against the long-term, inspiring vision of true independence, arriving maybe at a place of hopeful realism. Now, this journey to true sovereignty, it's undoubtedly fraught with immense challenges, demands huge sacrifice, immense courage, but here's a final thought to leave you with. How can this renewed sense of national and regional will be translated into tangible, widespread development that truly benefits every African? How can this powerful drive for regional unity build real transformative infrastructure, roads, railways, digital industries that moves beyond just slogans and genuinely uplifts communities right across the continent? Something to think about. We encourage you to keep thinking critically about these global power dynamics, about the evolving meaning of sovereignty. Keep exploring, keep questioning, maybe share these insights in your own conversations. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.